Fernando, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. Joe and I are excited to learn about your journey as a researcher and how we can help attract and retain other researchers in the field.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, one of the things I thought we'd start with is we're focused on grant writing, so getting funded for research, and a piece of that is just writing, just getting words on a page. Could you share some tips that you've used that help you get your grants written?
Yeah, I think by far the thing that's the scariest to face a blank piece of paper, right? Because it's always an effort to get started. So what I tell people is the most important thing is that you start to get your ideas on paper. And the second that I think is important is not to try to make it perfect. Sort of perfection can be a paralysis and that prevent you from moving forward. But you try to get some ideas and then share your ideas with other people. And one of the things that I think people that when they start to write is they recognize that they put something in paper but it doesn't have the structure that it needs. So the third advice would be make sure that you're actually meeting those structural requirements that a particular grant has, because every grant is different. But at the end, you want to write a compelling story that everybody can follow from beginning to end. So I like to share things that I do with people that are in different fields, for example. And aside of technicalities, does the story flow well? Do you understand it? But the most important thing is don't, overcome the anxiety of getting started, and then don't procrastinate, because people, they look at that blank piece of paper, I'll do it tomorrow. Just get something. Once you get something on paper, you'll feel that things can start to flow a little bit better, and it doesn't have to be perfect.
How do you do that? I mean, I know how you do it because now you're experienced and you've done this enough, but thinking back, or as you advise mentees, how do you get past the procrastination or the fear of the blank page or the fear of sharing something that's not fully baked?
Yeah, I think one good way to start, particularly for someone who's never done it before, is to try to write it as a story. And it could be sort of the initial central skeleton that you're going to be adding more and more information to it. But at least the central piece, it's there. And then remind yourself why you're doing this. What gets you excited? What is the motivation? I think the key to prevent procrastination, which I think at some point we're all guilty from or will suffer from, is to really let that excitement flow and share that excitement with other people. Grants are something that it's a product that you're gonna try to sell to someone, and they're gonna give you money or something for it. So they're obviously not gonna invest in something that they don't like or they don't find exciting. And I think some of the problems that I see is that some people write something that is lacking that enthusiasm that comes through the writing.
I agree. Actually, I tell people, write it as enthusiastic as you can without using an exclamation point.
Exactly. Because you could oversell it, right?
Yes. Right. And what were you going to say?
So where do you draw that excitement from, or that passion, or what excites you about research?
I think for me, research has always been an opportunity to answer important questions about public health or the health of patients. So my enthusiasm comes from what I believe ultimately my goals are, which is to improve lives. And so that enthusiasm comes across in your writing, in trying to really share the story in a way that compels someone to try to invest in it. And so that means, for example, really outlining what are the important elements that are leading to your question, and then how your question, this is really important, how your question fills a particular void that is particularly what you're trying to sell, right? Because people don't want to pay you for something that someone else already done. Mm-hmm. So the excitement is this is a new idea that's going to answer some exciting things, and it's going to lead to something really new. But then the trick is, how do you say that without saying it, right? Because if I write in a grant, this is incredible, this is so good, people are going to be like, well, you're overselling, right? So how can you sell that in a story that in between the lines, the excitement exists, right? But you're not necessarily saying, buy this product from me, right?
I love that you said, when you were talking about people sort of just getting started, just getting words on a page, to tell it as a story. I like that because sometimes when you just get into the zone of telling the story, you don't worry about your sentence or about whether it's strong enough or weak enough. You're just telling it the way you see it.
Exactly.
You've done so many types of research. Could you tell us the story of a grant that you loved?
Yeah. One of the grants that I'm working on has to do with a lot of my research focuses on doing studying the intersection between obesity and metabolic disorders and asthma. We've come sort of late into the game to understand that these problems affect not only the blood vessels but affect the airways as well. And so that's where most of my research is. And so we have an intervention right now. It's a clinical trial, which is funded by the NIH, and it took me 4 tries. So 2 rejections and then move forward. So I had a story that I built from looking at things in my patients that I thought were important to answer. But what I wanted to sell was not going to be compelling enough until I had a certain level of information. So that comes back to the point, and that sometimes you have to scale back your question. And maybe what you need to do is, what is that piece of information that you need to sell the rest of the story? And that's exactly what I need. When I came to Colorado, I did a much more limited sort of iteration of the trial, and I shared the results with the reviewers, and that allowed me to go for a much larger product. But it wasn't until I did then that people say, I want to fund this person. So at some level, the story has to be supported by some level of evidence. Now, when you're starting and you have a smaller project, it could be that what you need to do is, tell the people that are going to fund you that you're the right person to do it, and it's an important problem, and you have the ways to do it, even though you may not have preliminary data, for example, right? Because not every grant starts with preliminary data necessarily. Some small projects start just with a good story, and a good question, and a good product.
Now, how would you pretend we're talking to the novice researcher? You don't have a bunch of pilot data. You don't have a big track record. How do you have a good idea. How do we help people make the case that they are the right person to tackle this question?
There's a little bit of, it's a good question. There's a little bit of a background. So you have to sell a little bit like where you are at that particular time, like what you've done, and say, listen, I'm someone who gets things done. I've done some other projects, or I participated with some people on some other projects. And therefore people, have the idea that, you're someone who we can trust with some money to get some idea going on. So one thing is selling what makes you a good person to develop the project. And the other thing that's important is selling your environment, right? Even though I have no preliminary data, I'm working with people that are really good at what they do, and they're supporting me. And this is the letters that say so, right? And so people sort of maximize those things and minimize the lack of preliminary data, right? So if you're a good person for that project, and you're in the right environment, with strong letters and a good story, then people are like, this is a really exciting proposal. Doesn't have any data, but we're willing to take some risk. Remember that anybody that funds you are assuming some level of risk, right? Will you get the job done? Are you going to complete it? At the end, whether it's effective or not, we don't know, because that's why you would do the research, right? Otherwise, if you knew the answer, people would just like, you don't need any money, you already know what we need. So that part is always a question, right? Will it work or not? Well, that's where you do the work. But can you do it? That's a different question, right?
Isn't the lack of data the purpose for a pilot grant?
Indeed. And there's many mechanisms, both at the NIH and private institutions and universities, that will actually fund you to obtain pilot data. Like the example that I gave on my own. I didn't have a pilot data, but I had seed money, which is a different story. So I had some money as a faculty member that I utilized as a pilot grant. But many grants are pilot, because you need that particular piece of information to, if you're asking for $50,000 or you're asking for $5 million, then people that are going to fund you at that level are going to require a lot more hard evidence that your story has the potential to be meaningful.
Yes. So it sounds like pilot data would be a very important goal for an early career researcher. First, because it gives them experience asking for money, telling their story, getting it, and they really have a chance to execute on a scope of work that is great evidence that they can do it to the next grant, right? You're really taking small steps to get to the medium steps to get to the big steps.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And I also think it's interesting that you're emphasizing some of what you're signaling is about you as a researcher, your capacity to get things done, the environment you're working in, really separate from the actual science you're proposing, right? Because we hope it works out. You may have a compelling hypothesis. You're like, have I found something new? Okay, yeah, that'd be great. But it might not work. That's okay. But it's a lot about, can you do it?
Can you do it? And these are things, so these are elements in the can you do it space. These are different elements that in many review study sections, as you know, and they get evaluated separately. You know, you have stratum for environment, one for the investigator, one for the approach, and all these things, right? So they get looked at individually. At the end, they get all put together. But like, you know, if you're working, we have a great question, and you're starting, and you're working on a place where nobody has any idea what you're doing, nobody's ever done it, and people be like, good idea, super high risk. Nobody's going to be able to help him or help her, right? Be successful.
So when you do run into stuff where it just doesn't work out and it happens, how do you deal with that failure?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think that although we don't talk about it as much, failure is a necessary step of progress and success. You know, we all look at other people's career and we always think that it's like a straight arrow up, but in reality, it's a very messy. It's like driving through the mountains, right? It's like you got you have unexpected turns. Things in life happen, right? The one common denominator is that you're persistent. But failure is really part of the process, right? And I think you have to I tell my trainees to take failure in a very constructive way, in the sense of like, okay, this has happened. What can I learn from it so that I can, you know, pick up and have a better strategy, have a better approach, right? What do you learn? Because failure is not a problem. The problem is not learning from your failures. Then they can start to pile up and you feel victimized, when in reality what reviewers are telling you is like, hey, we found these weaknesses in you. Any project proposal has weaknesses, right? Mm-hmm. And we want you to work through them and give us back something that's better than what you started with. Mm-hmm. But it's easier said, it's demoralizing, right? Like you get it and you feel terrible and you like start having these thoughts of, you know, the imposter syndrome. And of course, how did I ever think I should apply for this? It's like, what was I thinking? That is a wrong approach, right? It's not about your persona. A grant doesn't define you as an individual. It's just a product that you're proposing that can be improved. And this is the way you have to look at it, right? Some people are like really shattered and be like, there's a grant and then it's you and the individual are not the same thing, right? But it's tough. I tell, you know, same thing with papers, right? So what I tell my trainees is like, when you get rejected, you have 24 hours, 48 hours, go yell, scream, victimize, like tear it apart, but then come back with a fresh new perspective on things, right? So get it all out. They don't know what they're talking about. It's ridiculous, right? And then come back and be like, okay, let's get the show on the road.
Right. Do you give them a certain amount of time?
Yeah, you know, a couple of days, go feel sorry about yourself for a while, but then let's get this back on the right track. But what you don't want to do is, and that I think is what important mentorship is a key element of grant of being successful, right? Unless you have a mentor that says, you know, I got you. You failed, I have failed too. We'll work through this together. Because you know, as a trainee, you know you're going back to an environment that's not going to minimize you because you had a failure.
Right. And to your point, Fernando, I mean, you're obviously an excellent mentor because you're willing to say, hey, the grant I'm doing now, the one I love, I missed multiple times.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you're no beginner. You've done this a lot. You're highly successful. Yeah, that's part of it. And I think being willing to share your, you know, that this is part of it. It's normal. It's normal.
And I think what's true too, because experience counts as well, is that if you look at the ratio of rejections to acceptance, it's much greater when you're starting, right? Then as you move through the field and you become, you know, it's like learning a trade, right? You get good at writing grants. People start to recognize your name. You get some products out there. It's going to be easier for you to get funded, even in high-risk proposals, right? You know how to do it.
Right, you have a bigger track record.
Right, so if you look at somebody who's really well-established, they have a few rejections, but I'm sure when they started, they have a ton of rejections. That's just the way it is.
Did you always know you wanted to do research, or how did you end up here?
I'm actually not. I went through medical school and training, really very focused on becoming a clinician. But then during my fellowship, I had the opportunity to do research, which was basic science research, like working in animal models, which has nothing to do with what I do today. But I really became enamored with the process of having a question and trying to answer it. And I think researchers, one thing that we are addicted to is data and results, right? So I found that the whole paradigm of questions to doing something and then having an output that then you evaluate in the context of a broader problem. And so when I went back to Mexico, I couldn't do my bench science anymore because I was not, so I was on a J1, so I had to go back to Mexico for 2.5 years. So I finished my training, went back to Mexico, and I was offered a job doing air pollution research. So I went from being somebody who did basic animal work to do air pollution research. And that, I loved it.
Was that so you took it so you could work in research in Mexico?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then that work that I did, and believe it or not, it's like that life really goes different circles. The work that I did in air pollution got me a job to come back in the CDC, for which I worked 8 years.
Okay.
As an epidemiologist.
So that was just chance that you ended up animal models to air pollution. And natural to CDC.
And now I don't do air pollution.
Except you do asthma.
I do asthma.
Right? So also kind of
it's
connected.
Related. Everything is connected.
A little bit.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now you told us you're a pulmonary critical care doctor.
Right.
But fellowship was to do that specialty, or was it to do research?
Part of in these fellowships you typically have half your fellowship is devoted to research. So I split mine doing, I did a year in the lab, and then I did 6 months at the NIH doing clinical research, which I really, really enjoy. So I've been exposed to many types of research, and at the end, the common denominator is the same, right? It's a hypothesis, having rigorous methodology to test it, but at the end, air pollution, animal models, clinical research, they follow some very similar approach to things, right?
Right.
In some level, they're the same, right?
I mean, that's, Joe's working in his first research job as a lab tech and wondering, how do I build a career? What kind of research? What kind of clinical population? And I said, just learn the methods, learn the approach. You can, the research enterprise has a very similar range of things, whether you're doing devices or drugs or clinical research or translational research.
Yeah, learn the methods, learn to enjoy it. I mean, you have to kind of, I tell people, you have to enjoy the journey, right? Because these things take time, right? My first paper took me forever to write, but then I loved it when it came out, right? So you have to, but I enjoy the process getting there, even with its ups and downs, Yeah. If you ask me that question every day, you got different answers. But in the long haul, it's something I enjoy doing. That's why I stay in it.
Do you find, some people do take rejection harder than others. Yeah. We talked about this. You give your mentees a couple of days. I will say for me, I used to take longer, right? But the more you practice getting rejected, so it takes less and less and less time to turn it around. But is that enough usually, just giving people a timeline? Do you find some people really struggle with the model of feedback and criticism?
Indeed, I think there's some people who take it very, very hard, and it'll take them a little bit longer to come out of it. But so I think with those trainees, I think the goal is to try to get them to see that it's not, the comments of the reviewer are not coming on them as a person or their value as an individual, right? Because I think that's where the feelings get stuck. Like, I'm not worth it, right? And so I go from this grant, this project doesn't define you, right? So you have to just get in that perspective and then see it more. I think once you get there, you see it clearly that it's a product, and failing gives you an opportunity to improve it. It does. I think we just unfortunately live in a system that doesn't normalize failure as part of the process. But we need to normalize failure. and be able to talk about it candidly, like
Yes.
we try to, and when people go to give talks, you show your best, you put on your best clothes, right? You show your best data, but behind it, I was talking to a researcher today, behind those talks, there are a lot of failed experiments, a lot of papers that went nowhere, a lot of trial and error, right? And I wish that people would more candidly say, this is where I am now, but this is how long, this is all the data that led to this point, right?
Yes. It's sort of the research version of social media,
Yes.
right? Right. Where every picture is, you
Right.
on a fabulous beach, or where,
Right.
everything is curated.
Right.
But that's not real. We know this is not true. Is that right?
I like that analogy.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Fernando, if we want to just talk a little bit more about resubmission, because as we've discussed, it's very hard to get funded the first time. And, it's not quite a lightning strike, but, the odds are against you. So everybody's going to be resubmitting. And it seems that that's the critical step. You need to mourn, get upset, then get back to it.
Yeah.
Do you recommend specific things that people do to make a really good resubmission?
Yes, that's a really good point. I think, a lot of it depends on the grant, but there's some common basics. So I would say if you get comments back, really spend some time looking carefully at those comments. And, there are parts of those comments that are actionable. So those are the kind of parts that identify those actionable items that are weaknesses in your project that you can act on and do something about it. Like people may want more experiments or more data or more a lot of them have to do with clarity. And so I separate them into things that require additional data to things that require clarification. Because sometimes what happens is you may have had a great grant with good data, but they didn't understand the story. They just didn't get it. And so sometimes, and that's in some essence, that's your fault. You need to go back and readdress the story and refocus it. And but when you go back, typically most grants will give you the opportunity to say your response to critiques, right? So you have these critiques. So reviewer one said blah blah blah. Then your response to reviewer one is the following, right? So I would say it's lesson number one: never fight with reviewers. People come back and well, this is ridiculous that you're asking this question, because I'm an associate editor, and so I'm in our journal, we get a lot of, I work with that every day. Nothing makes a reviewer angrier than a comment that's aggressive.
How dare you say that you're wrong? I said it on page 4.
Reviewers are humans too, right? So you could be a reviewer one day. So you'll make a comment, and you could be wrong, right? You could be wrong. And so what I did is we appreciate the reviewer's concern, However, to address this issue, the following, as noted in that part of the grant, right? You don't have to say, you didn't read it, right? You say, yeah, here it is. We've addressed it, and to make it more clear, we've highlighted it in such a way. We've actually made it an earlier part of the story, right? Because it's important for one particular reviewer. So you go along and you take the reviewer seriously, and when you come back, you have to have a product that's fundamentally different than the one you submitted. If you only do a superficial makeovers, reviewers are gonna be like, you didn't take our comments seriously.
Right. So they say there's actually a score that says responsiveness to reviews.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to say, were they responsive? And that's where they have the final say, right? If you say, hey, it was here, whatever, we just did a little drizzly do, you go, were they responsive?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and so you can't submit the same thing with a couple of sentences changed. It's just going to be,
No bueno.
And some no bueno. And you'll have, sometimes what I've seen grants is that reviewers had, you outlining all these actionable, and you separate the comments, and maybe there could be 50 comments, right? In one page, which is typically what you get the NIH to respond, you're not going to be able to address every single one of them. So you have to prioritize. You can group them, like reviewers 1, 2, and 3 had this similar concern. So you one response for all those concerns, right? So you maximize and you prioritize. If you cannot answer all of them, somebody may say, well, University of Colorado, it's located geographically in an area, whatever. And it's like, you're not going to be able to do anything about it, right? And that happened to me because I do research in obesity, and Colorado is the leanest state in the country. And so one reviewer said, he's not going to be able to recruit obese patients. I mean, the fact that we're the leanest state in the country doesn't mean
it's relative, right?
Right? Doesn't mean
Sadly.
there are no people with elevated BMIs. And it's like, so again, how you respond, we appreciate the reviewers'
It's a
comments.
great comment.
Indeed, Colorado is the leanest state. However, a large percent of the population, and you put the reference, have issues with obesity, especially in minority groups in our state, right? And the fact that we've recruited people with these issues before, and that reviewer be like, yes, what was I thinking? That was a wrong comment to make, right? But you backed it up with data.
And
with
you took
evidence,
it
right?
seriously and
took it seriously,
respectfully, right?
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You cannot answer back like, I wish Colorado was fatter. Right? So.
Can I ask a question? When you do research that is targeted to populations that tend to be underserved, like you mentioned, minority populations may have a particular prevalence or incidence of a disease.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance making something about a very specific group with is that excluding
Right.
other groups, or
Yeah.
how do you I think a lot of people really care about health equity.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I think a lot of people struggle with being very specialized, very focused, or does it have to be multiple groups? Does it have to be about everybody? Can you talk about how
Yeah.
you've approached it?
I think representation is key. For example, if you look at a lot of the vaccine trials, and they were for COVID, and there were studies that show that the clinical trials that were tested did not have sufficient minority representation, which happened to be one of the most impacted groups, Blacks and Hispanics, for example, right? So it's important to have representation, and the NIH wants you to have representation in your grants. Like, they have these tables where you have to say how many Blacks and how many Hispanics and how many Native Americans, and you have to break a proportion that is supposed to represent the population that you're studying. Now, that has its own problems in a way, because sometimes you cannot analyze those numbers independently, but the concept is good. The problems are, and I think that it's an issue of trust, because of examples that maybe we're all pretty aware, Tuskegee and other issues. So, for example, there's well-documented studies that show that, Blacks really distrust participation in research. And historically, and it's very prominent.
For reasonable reasons.
For reasonable reasons.
Historical reasons.
So, and Hispanics may be fearful because you have federal funding and they don't want to be deported if there are all these anxieties and fears that may be unique to different groups.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are 2 points that are important to remember. Is like, how do you build that trust? And that trust is built, because I did community research in Pittsburgh and around the U.S.-Mexico border in Mexico. You have to be able to tell the people that you're there for the long run. Because, you can go to a community that's primarily underserved populated, and then you want to say, I'm going to do this research. And what you'll get back, which has happened to me, is people will say, we know you university types, you come in here, you tell us how bad we have it, then you go back and write your paper and we'll never see you again, and we get no benefit. So you have to build that. Possibly, which is true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is true, and it's happened here. You go to some of these, communities in Swansea and Commerce, and I want to do an asthma project. It'd be like, the concept that people have is like, you're in your ivory tower and you're using them to gain some information that is not going to come back to them and help them in any capacity, and that's not fair. It's like, think about some of the HIV trials that were done in Africa, that when the trials were over, people didn't have access to those drugs. So those are ethical part of research that's important when you're dealing with more vulnerable populations. It's like, is the question that you're trying to answer going to benefit them in some capacity? Are you providing some tangible benefit for their participation that helps them, right? Mm-hmm. For example, if you're doing a particular study, will you leave some resources in place? Will you make a drug available for the long term? What is the real tangible benefit? And most people will not want to participate if you're doing community type of work unless they trust you. And that takes time. That takes a long time.
So that's very interesting. So really think about tangible benefit to populations that might have reasonable reasons to need more trust.
Mm-hmm.
like in human subjects research, you have to say, there's some benefit, right? Beneficence. You're not allowed to do any study just for the heck of
Just for
it.
the heck of study.
There has to be a benefit, but the benefit could be to the field, not necessarily to the community. So it sounds like we as researchers would go further to design a study that has some tangible benefit to build the relationship.
And I think key to that point is, community-based participatory research. What you do is you just don't come and be like, I have question X, and your community, by the way, is plagued with problems with X. So I want to, use this platform to answer my questions. And the reality is like, the community may look at you and be like, you know what? We know that X is important. We have other problems to deal with. We don't really care. So people that do community-based research that is done well, they actually partner with the community and identify questions that are important for the community. And then I think where there's a true partnership is when academia comes in and be like, we can help you answer those questions that you're interested in, that we also are interested. Mm-hmm. But we're not just going to use you I'm using use in a very general word, to answer a particular question that may not even be relevant to you.
And how do you find those questions?
Is you partner with the community. Okay. Like we did a study here in a lot of, when I directed the Latino Research and Policy Center for a while. And one of the questions when I came in that people had a lot of really important concerns was trying to understand the effects of air pollution and noise and traffic in the people living in motels in Colfax, because a lot of migrant populations, transient populations. And so we actually met with a lot of people in Colfax and the motels and the laundromats, and we created our own little internal board that included community members, and we designed a study in which we went in and actually measured pollution in homes and the motels, and took endpoints in health outcomes that people were interested. And so we did it, and we actually answered specific questions that were important for the community.
So can I ask a question about that? That sounds fascinating. I can imagine that people who end up living in motels on Colfax have a lot of problems that they would like solved. You wanted to study pollution. Did you say, tell me all the things you care about and we'll study some of this and pollution? Or did you try to get them to say pollution? Or, how did you navigate that?
It's a great question. So I think it's hard to, we tend to become very reductionist. Like you have a question, you have your hypothesis, you want to answer it. But especially when you do human research, people are not just one exposure, one outcomes, right? They have all these concomitant problems, right? We call them comorbidities or competing risks. And so you have to address them in your analysis to understand whether they're particularly more important than the exposure you're measuring, or they contribute to make it worse. Like, for example, we know that when you get exposed to pollution, you get sick. But if on top of it you're stressed, you have high levels of stress, then the pollution interacts with the stress to make outcomes even much more severe. So there are things about, we call that interaction. So the things about interaction, how things that work together to produce, poor health outcomes. So as a researcher, if you're in the community or you're doing clinical work, you have to understand the complexity of the environment, right? I mean, if you're doing work with animals in the lab, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, it's another type of problems you have to deal with, right?
Right.
You control the environment much more.
I love the idea of you, the example of pollution interacting with stress is a really neat way to engage a lot of the cares of the community, because probably the stressors are problems,
right.
But you do it in the context of this outcome that you care about too.
Right.
So you're still bringing your own ideas to the table as a researcher, right? Like,
right.
Sometimes we worry that, should we let a junior researcher go engage with the community because their ideas are big already, and we're trying to get them to narrow, but the community is going to say, but I have this and this and this and this. Right. So it is a little bit of a dance with learning so much and building relationships, and hold on, we still need to do something that you can have a positive outcome, right?
Yeah, you want to do something, and at the end, after all these complexities, You can put on a paper and somebody say, okay, this is important, is potentially reproducible, right? It can be applied somewhere else. It's rigorously done. So you have to, it's a whole complex, all the way from being on the ground to actually putting it on the ground, right?
Yes. So a great mentor would help with that for sure.
Yes.
Right? How do you recommend early career researchers, young people, especially if they're in a small institution where there aren't so many, researchers around, how do you recommend they meet or find research mentorship?
It's a good question. I think that sometimes people don't necessarily feel confident enough to expand their horizons a little bit. So I get requested by other people in our institutions to serve as part of their mentorship teams, and I'm always happy to do it when I can. But so I think people need to ask, broadly, not only institution, but maybe if you're passionate about a topic, then find out who are the key people that are recognized in that field or in that particular question, then contact them. I mean, the worst that can happen is say no. You contact them, it's like, hey, introduce yourself. I'm really interested. Can we talk sometime? What would you have advice? Is there you or somebody else in the group can help me review a proposal, be part of my mentorship team? So you're gonna find some roadblocks, but eventually you're gonna find someone who's invested in academic medicine, as we all are, to help our trainees, whether they're in the institution or not.
Have you ever reached out to somebody like that? Would you?
Yeah, I would.
See?
When you listen to Fernando say that, do you think, oh, I wouldn't? Or like, what would that email look like? Or what are you thinking?
I would just be curious what direction I would go in, because research is so big. There's so many departments. I think it'd be hard to even know where to go, what website to go on, what to Google to find someone to know. I think it's just a connection thing.
It is. I mean, I think sometimes you can ask the people here that know you, hey, my project, what I'm interested in, do you recommend somebody I can talk to?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And also you can look at, depending on the project, right? But if you have a project, most projects have specific documents attached to it and articles people have published. So you can always not Google, but PubMed, use different data set resources and find out who you can email, right? I mean, I get random emails, and you have to be strategic, right? So if I'm emailing Professor Jones at X, Y, and Z institution, I'll be like, Professor Jones, I'm such and such, I apologize for sort of coming into your busy day, but I'm super excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm doing this, and I'm just being fascinated by these, interesting questions and data, and I was wondering if you potentially could help me guide some ideas. This is my project, what it's about. Can I send you something? I mean, just be very polite, but also be very excited, because people like that, especially more advanced researchers. They want to see that excitement in younger researchers, and so it's very engaging, right? Mm-hmm. So again, it's all about how you sell it, right? Strategically sell it.
Sometimes I think people are afraid to reach out. Also, sometimes you just change institutions. You're in a new place, whether you're going to a fellowship or a postdoc, or you're taking a new faculty job, you came to Colorado, or you've been in Mexico, now you went to the CDC. Every time you change, you have to meet people all over again. I mean, you always bring those connections, but when I have a new mentee, I give them homework every week. They are to go meet with a new person just to get to know them, and I'll give them a number of names, and I say, you go reach out on your own behalf. You could tell them that I gave you your name, or if you want me to help you make the connection, okay, but just go have a little conversation, learn about them, tell them a little bit about what you're interested in, and then I say at the end of every meeting, say, now that we've talked, who else should I talk to here? I'm new. I'm trying to meet people. And I think people are very eager to help people connect and get to know their environment.
Especially someone like you brokers that connection, right? I get a lot of instances in which, another senior person says, hey, can you meet with one of my mentees during the conference? And we'll have a cup of coffee and chat, or just meet between conferences or whatever. And, I love that. I mean, I love meeting new people and hearing about what they're doing and giving them feedback.
Okay, so junior people can feel confident to
Of
reach
course.
out to a super senior person.
Most people are nice and are willing to. Now, there are obviously a few bad apples here and there, but I won't let that discourage. Somebody says no, then try the next
Just
person.
say, okay,
down
great. Is there anybody
down
else?
the list, right?
Yeah, I would say don't even let them off the hook. If you get the chance,
Yeah.
ask, is there anybody else in the field that would be interesting?
And it can lead to, like, I'll give you an example. The person, when I went from Atlanta to Pittsburgh, I actually reached out to a researcher that's really, really, really famous, really well known. And I said, hey, listen, I've been working on these things. I have this piece of data. I'm having a hard time understanding. Can I show them to you? Can I show them and maybe give me your feedback? And she did. And we corresponded a few times. And then a few years later, she hired me.
Nice.
And I ended up going to Pittsburgh. I was there for 8.5 years before coming here. So you never know where these relationships evolve, right? And go. So,
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Fernando. We really appreciate it.
of course.
Thank you.
Enjoyed talking to you. It was fun.